The PFC had adopted economic objectives for Lost Creek-Boulder Creek, and the first one was jobs and income distribution, and that one's covered within the draft EIS. There were two indicators that were suggested that dealt with public and private financing, and essentially it's asking the question, what contribution to the project costs can stumpage values make for the project? And this is really following sort of the objective, or at least one of the objectives for CFLRP, and that is to demonstrate the utility of forest products and wood utilization to offset or partially offset restoration treatment costs. So the first one's pretty simple, and there's a table S29 provides the data for it, and it is simply to calculate the forest product contribution to project cost. So it's just the revenue divided by the total project cost that's shown in table S29. So just a couple comments on that, though. If you look at this spreadsheet, this is right from the table, alternatives B, C, D, and E. Here are the total project costs, the projected revenue in each case, and then our target was based on the CFLRP proposal submitted in 2011. On average, the ratio is 22% that the stumpage value would contribute that much money, approximately 22% of the total project cost. So one really simple way to look at this is you could say, well, of the four alternatives, in terms of that PFC objective, which one comes the closest? Well, E does. D is a second runner-up, and the proposed action is a little under 12%. So again, one simple way to look at this would be just to rank them in terms of that PFC objective and look at also the other objectives. However, maybe a different way to approach that is, I think the tendency would be to argue, well, each of these alternatives should have their harvest level increased in order to get the revenue up to 22%. But perhaps a more practical way to interpret this is, let's take the projected revenue and simply divide that by 22%, then use that to target a project cost using the strategy for that alternative. With this revenue, B, the total project cost would then be a little over 13 million, and the relative goal priorities for the PFC would provide some context to determine which restoration actions should be kept or retained and which ones should be dropped in order to have a project cost that's around 13 million. The interesting one for me is C, with the low revenue. If you divide that by 22%, then the project cost becomes 6.8 million instead of 24.8 million. So in order to achieve that objective, it greatly reduces the scale of the restoration activity if C were to become the alternative in the record of decision. And similarly for D, we have a project cost that's about 19.5 million instead of 26.4, and E, a project cost of 17.75 million instead of 21.4. So anyway, the arithmetic is pretty simple, but I think there are different ways to interpret it. Then the second metric is really directed more at how much is the harvest compared to growth within the project area. And I had originally proposed this to the coalition as a way to balance the target harvest revenue, stumpage revenue, to document that even at that level, it is still a relatively modest harvest level compared to what the average growth is. But let me just explain this graph and then go into some of the kind of what I call the back of the envelope in order to achieve it. The vertical axis is the percent of growth harvested within the project area over the 10-year life of the project compared to the estimate of growth over that period. The x-axis is the percent growth retained over that 10-year period. And then along the line here are the four alternatives and identifying where they fall, what combination do they have. And I'll explain in a minute where the values came from using some fairly simple assumptions. This is a national forest, so you wouldn't expect it to be harvest equal growth, but if this 80,000 acres were in private ownership, the value of that land for property tax appraisal purposes in Idaho would be based on a series of payments, assuming that the landowner with a more or less custodial level of management would be harvesting growth over a 10-year period. So that would be the private landowner up at this end. The landowner that is doing nothing would still be taxed at that level, but if you were to retain all growth and derive no income from forest products, you'd be at this end of the graph. Now, as a national forest, again, nobody would expect the Payette or even the Lost Creek-Boulder Creek project area to be up at 100%. The forest management plan pushes it down this direction. The management prescription categories certainly have an effect, including an inventoried roadless area. The fact that there are species of concern and water quality regulations, which the forest must address, decreases it some. And in addition, the strategy of restoration of targeting certain potential vegetation groups, tree size classes, and canopy closure classes directs it down towards this way on the graph. But I do think it gives an indication that this is not, under any of the alternatives, A, B, C, D, or E, it's not an overly aggressive harvest strategy. So C is a 14% harvest compared to growth, so 86% of it is retained on the stump. At the higher end, D, 41% of the estimated growth would be harvested over the 10-year period, and 59% retained. So where does this come from? And I want to emphasize that this is just really truly a back of the envelope approach, but I took the total project area of 78,500 acres, subtracted the estimate of non-forest, got the forested acres, and then using the FIA data for Valley and Adams County, both, it was close to 200 board feet per acre per year, and I used a stumpage value of $100 per thousand board feet, just to use a number that's in the neighborhood but round. So that the 10-year growth based on that annual growth would be just under 130 million board feet, and using that stumpage value would be $12.9 million. For this alternative, which is alternative B, the projected harvest from a table in the draft EIS was 35.8 million board feet over the project period, a harvest value of 3.58 million, and the growth retained is 93 million board feet. So on the 93 million board feet, I applied the stumpage value to that and calculated that the opportunity cost of retaining that growth is over $9.3 million. So I know the two economists were at our meeting in August, I believe it was. We're discussing some of the qualitative measures for ecosystem services. Well, I mean, this is somewhat related, not exactly putting a value on ecosystem services, but I think you can say that it's an opportunity cost in which the public is willing to invest $9.3 million over the life of the project by retaining growth and not harvesting it. And again, the harvest as a percent of growth is 27.7%. The same thing was done for alternative C, the same basic assumptions, and the projected harvest of 18.6 million was taken out of the draft EIS. So in this case, the growth retained is over 110 million board feet, and the opportunity cost of retaining that stumpage, that growth, rather than harvest, it is 11 million. D has a projected harvest of 53 million, harvest value of 5.3, and the opportunity cost for that alternative is 7.6 million. And then for E, the projected harvest is 48.3 million board feet, $4.8 million, and growth retained of almost 81 million board feet and over $8 million opportunity cost. So returning to the graph, again, that was the source of the points on this graph for the four alternatives. And I think another footnote to this is that given the uncertainty in each alternative of how many acres may drop out of the candidate list, it's probably hard to differentiate between D and E. Are those differences really significant, or are they essentially the same outcome, even though the strategy between the two alternatives is slightly different? So, in summary, there are two indicators. One, the simple one of just calculating a percent of revenue compared to costs, and interpret that either as a ranking, or else an alternative interpretation of it is, given that revenue, what would the maximum project cost be in order to achieve a 22% contribution from stumpage to the total project cost. And the second is to clearly document what that harvest level is compared to the potential growth increment, or the estimated growth increment within the 10-year project life. Use that to compare the four alternatives, but also to assess the opportunity costs of the growth retained, and the growth is retained for a variety of other resource management purposes, either due to management prescription classes in the forest plan, other direction from the forest plan, or regulations either with species of concern or water quality.